Welcome to Mom in Mind, a podcast about maternal mental health, discussing conception, pregnancy, birth, and postpartum. Real stories from moms and family members who have made it from struggling to wellness, and interviews with experts and advocates who work for moms and families to get the help they need. This podcast is meant to offer information and awareness and is not a replacement for treatment by a professional or professional training. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Mom in Mind. I'm your host, Dr. Kat. On this episode, we're talking with Ingrid Esparza. She is going to share her personal story, and some of the things that she talks about can be difficult for some of you to hear, especially if you've had your own experience with birth trauma or postpartum hemorrhage, to be more specific. I'm very grateful to Ingrid for coming on to talk about her experience, in part because it's really in hearing ourselves reflected out in the world that we begin to realize that we're not alone and that we're not crazy and that, you know what, actually, I might need help and it's okay to get help. So for those of you who are currently, feeling the depth of any kind of trauma, I would just caution you if you're going to listen to this. So for those of you who do listen, I would love to know in what ways that it's helpful to hear other people's experience. And specifically, if you've had your own experience with a postpartum hemorrhage or traumatic birth experience or difficulty with breastfeeding, as Ingrid is going to talk about, I'd love to hear from you guys. Ingrid is originally from Mexico, but she's lived in the U.S. since she was 9 years old. She moved to Lincoln, Nebraska, where she currently lives, in October of 2015 from Savannah, Georgia. She's married and has a son who will be 3 at the end of July. She's been able to be a stay-at-home mom, but plans to go back to work in the fall. She holds a master's degree in early childhood education. She's led a Climb Out of the Darkness event in Lincoln for the past 2 years and hopes to continue to do more to bring awareness, education, and support to her community about perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. And as I said before, she's going to be talking about her experience with a postpartum hemorrhage and a traumatic birth and being apart from her son for a couple of days and what her experience was like with breastfeeding and how challenging that was. She's also able to share a little bit about how culture and her cultural experience could have helped or potentially impacted her experience. So without further ado, let's meet Ingrid. Welcome, Ingrid. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm very grateful that, I put the call out for people who wanted to share their stories, and I'm really grateful that you said yes. And I know it can be really difficult to tell your personal story sometimes, and how important it is for other people to hear stories so that they know that they're not alone. So I really, really appreciate you coming on. And if you feel comfortable, to just go ahead and start wherever you feel is appropriate to tell us about your experience.
Sure. Well, so to start off, I want to say that I was one of those, I guess you can say lucky, that I had an amazing pregnancy. From the second that I found out I was pregnant until the very end, everything just went pretty smoothly. I didn't really have morning sickness or, other than being tired the first trimester, everything was just great. And of course, my husband and I had been trying for, about 7 months or so, and we were just ecstatic about finally being pregnant and having a baby soon. Yeah. So we did everything to prepare, and everything, once again, was going smoothly until probably towards the end of my due date. I was still feeling fine, still feeling great, but I was not progressing in the sense of showing signs that I was going to go into labor anytime soon. Mm-hmm. And so I was going to a birth center, and they allowed me to go to up to 41 weeks and 5 days. And I did. On the day of 41 weeks and 5 days, I was going to have an at-home induction. And I started out that morning waking up and not feeling my baby. It was one of the scariest moments when I woke up and I just could not feel him. I didn't know it was a he at the time. And I immediately had some orange juice because I had heard that that works. And when it didn't work, I called my midwife, and she asked me to eat breakfast and then call her back. And so I did, and I was crying this whole time just because I knew something was wrong.
Right.
Meanwhile, my midwife was preparing to have somebody meet me at the birth center because it was before hours. I called her back, and she had me come into the birth center They immediately hooked me up into a machine. I don't remember what they're called, but they're essentially like to monitor the baby. I knew something was wrong when the nurse practitioner, usually she would hook me up to the machine and leave the room. This time she hooked me up and stayed and was massaging my belly. And it took a while to hear the heartbeat. We finally heard the heartbeat, and they called the lead midwife in. And because of the size of my baby, he was measuring 11 pounds, 5 ounces. They had to call their backup physician. The backup physician immediately suggested a C-section. And so I was transferred to the hospital, went in, had a C-section, met my baby boy, and everything was great. Like, we had him in our arms after, for a minute, we thought we had lost him.
Oh, gosh.
So that's kind of how my experience with being a mom started out. And then we had, I would say, about 2 hours that were just perfect. You know, our parents were there and we were just all happy and just enjoying the baby. But then maybe about after everybody had gone home, 2.5, 3 hours later, I just felt a gush, like something coming out of me. So we called the nurse, and unfortunate for me, it was during time or shift change. So when the nurse came in, she noticed the blood and she said, "Oh, you know, it's fine. I'll go ahead and change." And I think she thought that maybe I had not been changed in a long time. And that's why there was so much blood. So she changed my padding and everything. She left the room. Almost immediately after she left, I felt another big gush. And I asked my husband to call. Once again, because it was during shift change, you know, they're exchanging information and stuff. So it took her a while to come. We had to call a second time. And she came in finally after we called. I want to say maybe even 3 times. And she came in, she took a look, and she left the room.
Did she say anything?
No, she didn't say anything. She just left the room. Within minutes, our room was filled with what seemed like 20 people.
So at this point, you don't know what's going on?
I don't. No, I just...
Nobody has said anything to you about what they think is going on?
No. So it was the doctor that did my C-section is there, several nurses, and the hospital where I gave birth was a teaching hospital. So there were a lot of residents that were there in the room as well. So at this point, I don't remember whether they had explained exactly what was going on. I knew I was hemorrhaging, and it had clotted because I had been hemorrhaging for, I think, hours, but it just had not been caught. So one of the doctors wanted to go ahead and do an extraction, I guess, like go ahead and start taking all the clots out. And so she started doing that. I don't know how graphic you want me to get, but it was pretty traumatic for me because I declined morphine. At this point, I was thinking, oh, they just need to go in and do this. And then, you know, I'll be with my baby. And of course, I don't want morphine, you know, because I have this newborn. So I could literally feel everything every time she went in with her arm and was scraping my uterus.
That's pretty intense. And I'm sure, you know, for you, it was very intense. And for other people who have had that experience, you know, already you've been dealing with so much and now you're feeling all of this.
Yes, definitely. That's about the last that I remember. From there, my husband has filled in the gaps. I had lost so much blood and they could not stop the bleeding even after they had taken the clots out. So they had my husband sign a waiver. It was one of those things where the doctor said, you need to sign this right now. We need to rush her back into the OR.
Like some type of release for you to have surgery?
Yes. Yes. And he was told that they would get back in about 30 minutes or so to give him an update. And what had happened was my uterus would not contract back. I mentioned my son was measuring big. He ended up being 10 pounds, 12 ounces.
Yeah.
So he had stretched my uterus so much that it couldn't contract back. So they had to do a surgery to make my uterus think that I was still pregnant so that it would stop trying to contract. And because I had lost so much blood, they also had to do a transfusion.
Right.
And unfortunately, this landed me in ICU for 3 days. So I was separated from my baby for those 3 days. After I was taken back to the OR, from the time that I was back into a regular room, 4.5 days passed, and I got to see my baby for 5 minutes during those 4.5 days.
Oh, no.
So that was the beginning of my motherhood experience, which I would consider very traumatic and obviously not what I was expecting at all. Then I finally went home, after 3 days in ICU, and then they put me into a step-down room, kind of in between ICU and a regular room. And I was there for a full day, and then into a regular room, and I was there for a day. And then we finally got to go home.
Okay, so at this point, you haven't had a whole lot of time to see your new baby.
No.
Your husband is kind of managing as much as possible with the baby and with your care in terms of decision making and stuff like that.
Yes. He was there the whole time. The poor guy, I mean, he barely got any sleep, or, he was left with a newborn when I was taken. So,
So you're all dealing with a lot, to say the least. Baby was fine, though?
Baby was fine. He as healthy as can be. Yes.
Okay. So then if I can ask, what did you start to notice about how you were feeling, just your state of mind?
It took me a while to figure out that there was something going on. I was kind of in shock, I think, for a long time, even after I got home. I was worried, now that I have my baby, I felt like I had lost all those days. I needed to figure out breastfeeding. So all my kind of time and energy went into focusing, okay, I need to breastfeed him. And he wasn't latching.
This was like 5 days after delivery now?
Okay. Yes. And I thought, well, he's probably not latching because he had to take a bottle from the very beginning. And he got used to the bottle, so now I need to get him, used to my breast. So I started seeing a lactation consultant. And at this point, I was in survival mode and I was focused on breastfeeding. Like, I was obsessed. Like, I'm going to breastfeed this child.
If I can just kind of say that I think that is such a common response, not necessarily specifically breastfeeding, but after an experience like that, you're just trying to get yourself back together. And a lot of people describe becoming like hyper-focused on making sure that something that's important to them can happen because things have been out of your control for so long already.
Right. And that was my next focus, like just determined to breastfeed. So I started going to a lactation consultant about twice a week. I was going to see her and, trying to figure out why my baby wasn't latching. And it turned out he did have a tongue tie, and he also had torticollis, and he had some issues with his jaw and like the joints. He didn't have enough strength. So we started going to a cranial sacral specialist as well, just so he could have therapy and build his muscles and the strength. And constantly I joined every Facebook group that I could find about breastfeeding and, Googling everything I could, like, to see how I could keep my supply while, we're trying to get him to latch. And I used a nipple shield, and I remember even at one point he was sleeping pretty much through the whole night, about 6 hours, which is a lot for a newborn. And I was still having my alarm, and every 2 hours I was getting up and I was pumping because I felt if I don't pump, that's what I was told by my lactation consultant. If I don't pump, I'm going to lose my supply because he's not latching, and then it's just never going to happen.
So at this point, did you still sort of feel like you're in survival mode?
Yes, I still had not thought about what had happened. I'm just, thinking breastfeeding. But in one of those days, I was actually sitting in my baby's room, and I want to say he was taking a nap, and it had to be on a weekend because my husband was home. And I was pumping, and then my husband walked in just to check on me. And I just said to him, I almost died, didn't I? And he said, yes. Wow. And that was it. That's all I said. And then I went back to obsessing about breastfeeding. And that
did you feel like connected to that question emotionally, or did you feel kind of like numb to it?
I felt numb to it because my biggest concern at that moment was breastfeeding.
Right.
And, I didn't have the natural birth that I wanted. So this was the next thing. This was what I had to do in order to, be a good mom and, breast is best. And that's what I wanted and needed to do. And, of course, I would go to the lactation consultant and they would say, well, you just need to do this, this, and that. And, I remember spending so much money in like all these vitamins that they asked me to get because I was starting to lose my supply from him not latching. So finally, I could also tell that it just wasn't going to happen maybe because I would put my son, and even when he did start latching, he would fall asleep. He just, I didn't have enough supply for him to be interested in it, I guess. So finally, I hired the lactation consultant to come into our home and spend the whole day with me because I felt like every time that I would go to her office, she was essentially telling me that I was doing something wrong because, it didn't work. Yes. So finally, she came and she spent the whole day with us. And I showed her how I would put him to my breast and he would fall asleep almost immediately. But then if I would give him the bottle, he would eat. And after 2 or 3 times trying during that day, she finally said, oh, okay, like maybe you're not making this up. And I remember that following Monday, I was going to go into the office and I had a friend visit that weekend and I just had an amazing conversation with him. And I don't think he knows actually till this day, but that conversation made me realize that I just had to give up breastfeeding and it was okay. So I walked that Monday into the lactation consultant's office, just ready to say that I was done. And luckily she was also on the same page. And she said, you know what, I think that breastfeeding looks different for everybody. And, you're able to give him a little bit of milk and then supplement most of it. And that's okay. And so I let go of that.
So how long did that take? Like, how old is your son at this point?
He is probably about 3 months.
Okay. So you were trying for 2.5 months or almost 3 months.
Yes, it was a long time.
That is a long time.
Yes. So I think it was after I stopped breastfeeding because I didn't have that. And I did let it go. I was actually able, once I made that decision and stop seeing the lactation consultant, I was able to let it go. And because my mind finally cleared from the breastfeeding obsession, that's when I started realizing that I'm having all this anxiety. And I've started noticing these patterns, like I would never go in to see my son first thing in the morning. I would always send my husband because I was convinced that he was going to be dead and I didn't want to be the one to find the body. I started noticing that I'm afraid to give him a bath. And so I just made it into telling my husband, oh, you work all day. I'm home with him. This is your time with him. So, bath time and bedtime can be your time together. So my husband didn't even know. I started noticing these things, but I didn't say anything to anybody. I couldn't take him to the store. I could hardly take him out anywhere. And probably around this time, maybe about a month and a half later, when he was about 5 months old, I met this group of women and they were amazing. It was such a great support system for me. All of us had babies within a few weeks of each other. And so it was just a wonderful support system. And because they were always so reassuring, like, oh yes, motherhood is hard. And, the first few months are the hardest and we're adjusting, I felt reassured that, okay, well, maybe these thoughts are not as bad or, maybe they are normal. So I just kind of continued with life, having these thoughts and worrying all the time, but not really paying attention to them.
So it sounds like from the kind of thoughts you were having, like your primary worries was that somehow your son was going to die or be hurt.
Yes.
In some major way.
Yes. There was nothing specific. Like a lot of people, when I've shared about not being able to give him a bath, they were like, well, do you think he would drown? And I was like, not exactly. Like, I can't pinpoint what I thought exactly was going to happen. I just thought that it would happen. And I didn't want to be the one associated with a dead body. So that's why I would avoid bath time. I would avoid being the one going to get him in the morning from his crib because I didn't want to be the one finding the body.
So that's extremely intense, and it sounds like it was happening pretty regularly, those thoughts.
Yes, yes. So my son will be 3 at the end of July, and I did not give him a bath until he was almost 2 years old.
So you dealt with this for a long time.
Yes, yes.
And the thoughts, would they come in like a flash, or were they just kind of always there? What did it feel like?
I think some of them were always there. Some of them were more like a flash. Like, looking back, I also slept a lot. It's funny because a lot of people that I've heard, they worry so much that they're not able to sleep. I think that I almost went into like some major sleep so that I wouldn't have to think about it. But then first thing in the morning, as soon as I would wake up, immediately was like, oh my goodness, he's dead. So even if I was the first one that would wake up, I would not nudge my husband and be like, oh, go wake him up, And once again, I didn't tell my husband for a long time. So I would just play it off like, oh, go get him, just like a game. Like he gets to be the one to wake him up.
How long would you say that this was like an experience that only you knew about? Nobody else knew that you were feeling this way?
About 7 or 8 months. Yes, my son was about 7 or 8 months. And I started noticing that all these women that I mentioned earlier, they were getting back to normal. They were out and about. They felt very confident in doing things with their kids. And I was still having a hard time even going to the grocery store. Like, I would not go to the grocery store with my son. And it was always just with him. When I didn't have him, when I felt like I wasn't in charge of him, I was fine. But it was always surrounding him. So I started noticing, I'm still having all these thoughts, all these worries about something happening to him. And obviously we're all getting, it's getting closer. Now we're closer to the first birthday than the birthday. And I'm still having all of these. So I remember one day I just started Googling, like, what is going on? And at the time I lived in Savannah, Georgia. I came across Climb Out of the Darkness, which it's an event that it's held every June. And there was a person in Savannah that was leading this event. So I decided to join the team. And I remember going and reading more. I started reading like blog posts from Postpartum Progress and finally thinking, oh my goodness, people actually feel this way. And I guess I should clarify, like, never in my mind did it cross that it was like postpartum depression or anything, because I was happy and I'd never heard of postpartum anxiety. Never. Had no clue that that was a thing. So when I started reading all these things through Postpartum Progress, I realized that there is such a thing as postpartum anxiety. And I sort of self-diagnosed, I guess. Like I just read all these things. I was like, this is what I have. And then I talked to my husband about going to Climb Out of the Darkness in Savannah, and he was very supportive. And I led him into a few of my thoughts, but not all of them.
Right. Thank you for saying that. That's such a common experience that women and men who are suffering as well, but having this experience that's so just kind of internal and in your own, nobody else knows what's going on. And it is really hard to put that out there, like to share these kinds of thoughts. And how you just described it, that you just put a little bit out at a time, is so common.
Yes, I would say from the first time that I mentioned something to my husband until it was like full-blown disclosure, it was maybe almost a year, of letting him little by little. And I guess I wanted to test the waters, like, is he going to think I'm crazy? How is he going to react? Because I didn't want him to think that I didn't love him or that I didn't love my son or that I wasn't trying to be a good mom. But, it sometimes felt that way, like I just wasn't being good enough for him.
That's heartbreaking, and also another thing that I just hear so often. I mean, who wants to feel the way you felt, but you do. And it feels a lot like there's something wrong with you.
And yes, and that's exactly how I felt. In October 2015, so my son was just a little over a year old, we moved from Savannah, Georgia to Lincoln, Nebraska. And that's when things got really bad for me, just because I had lost that amazing support group that I had in Savannah. Moving here, I knew a couple of people and they were great, but, they work full time and I didn't really know that many people here. And I was alone, and it just started getting worse and worse and worse. Finally, I think my anxiety turned into a little bit of depression just from feeling so lonely. And one day I was trying to get my son to nap. And I guess I should mention, anytime that anything happened that did not go according to the schedule or how I thought it should go, it was just like a panic attack or a freak out moment for me.
Like related to your son specifically?
To my son, yes.
Okay.
So in this particular day, he always napped for 3 hours in the afternoon, starting around 1 until about 3, sometimes longer. So I went to put him down for a nap, and he just was not ready to nap this time. So after about 20 minutes of trying to get him to nap, I just started freaking out. I didn't know what to do. I thought the world was going to end because it's like, he should be napping right now. Why is he not napping? And I remember screaming at him and like not just raising my voice, but just screaming like, why are you not napping right now?
Yeah.
And I immediately caught myself and I was like, this is not me. So I left him in his crib. I went downstairs. I called my husband and I just said, you need to come home right now. So he came home and I was just sitting there crying. My son, the funny thing is he was just laughing. He was having a good time. He wasn't tired. So, he didn't want to nap.
Right.
And my husband went and got him. And then he said, I think you need to go see somebody. Mm-hmm. So he took my son for the rest of the afternoon just so I could have some time to myself. I found a counselor and started going to see a counselor on a weekly basis. And also got on medication. I had let it go too long to where I needed both the weekly sessions and the medication to start feeling somewhat normal again.
And did it help you?
It did. And that's one thing that I realized too. Having that social support was amazing, but it was not the only thing that I needed.
Right.
I needed the social support, sure, but I also needed the counseling. I needed to talk through the birth trauma because I realized that at that point, so my son was like a year and a half, I had not really discussed the trauma other than that one question of, I almost died, didn't I? Right. I had never really talked about it after that. And I needed to really talk to somebody who was trained and desynthesize my mind from it and be able to talk about it without just feeling so worried all the time. Because one of the things, anytime I had a friend who was going into labor, I was obsessive because I thought they were going to have the same complications that I did.
Right.
And until I heard that they were, the second that I heard, I'm going into labor, it's time, it's a go time, until I heard they were safe at home, I just kept worrying, that something was going to happen to them.
Right. And that's how that trauma shows up, as you start to worry about anything that's similar, either happening to you or happening to somebody else. That's very, very difficult. So looking back now on your experience, I'm curious to know what kinds of things were impacting your experience, and specifically, was there anything related to culture that either helped or impacted your experience?
So I think for me, I'm from Mexico. That's where I'm from originally. And I remember when I first got pregnant or found out that I was pregnant, I was excited about the thought that my mom was going to come and spend time with us, because that's what she had done with my sister. And that's just what Mexican moms do. And they make you broth, because you're not going to be eating that much other than broth. And they help take care of the baby. I remember my grandmother coming to stay with us when my sister was first born, and just any sound my sister would make, my grandmother would not allow my mom to get up because she needed to rest. So it was my grandmother, doing a lot of the caring for the baby. In my case, because my son was almost 2 weeks late, plus you add that week that I was in the hospital, Unfortunately, that my mom did spend like a month and a half with us, but 3 of those weeks were, I don't want to say wasted, but just used up in waiting the 2 weeks that my son was late and then the week in the hospital. So I didn't actually get as much time after the birth with my mom like I wish I would have. And I think that even that, like the start of me as a mom was not what I had envisioned. You know, it wasn't my mom around helping me with every little thing. And my mother-in-law was there, but it wasn't not the same. And actually looking back too, you know, I have a really good relationship with my mother-in-law, but she and I have talked about this and we'll both agree that she spent about a week with us after my son and I were home. It's probably the worst week of our relationship. And it's because I was just at her throat. Like she could not do anything right because she wasn't my mom.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, that's real. When you have that high level of intense anxiety, even if you're not aware of it, nobody does anything right.
Yes, exactly. And I think I had built up these expectations of how my birth was going to be, how the transition home was going to be. And when the reality didn't meet those expectations, it was just a setup for failure.
Yeah, that's so true. Right. So, I mean, you going into this feeling relatively okay, and then all of these like medical emergencies happen, and clearly it was traumatic and traumatizing. But I mean, just the way you described it too, being like in shock and being numb to this really traumatic event, that's coping right there. That's people trying to just like get through that kind of being in shock and numb. But it really does kind of disconnect you. And it sounded like you were disconnected for a little while from your experience.
Yes. And I think that's why I chose little projects. Like first it was breastfeeding, you know, like this is just my focus. Maybe it was my way to cope with it so that I wouldn't have to work through the birth trauma. And then finally, you know, that I would say my darkest moment was that day that I just screamed at my son. It was finally my breaking point.
Right, because it sounds like it was so unlike you and it sort of took you by surprise.
It did, yes. Most people would agree that I'm soft-spoken. And not that I never yell, because I do. And, you know, he's in his terrible 2s, starting his 3-nager years. So there's definitely been times where I've raised my voice at him. But this was unlike me. And I just, like I said, it wasn't just raising my voice. It was just full-blown screaming at him.
Right. Then a lot of moms who describe that similar thing feel really guilty afterwards. Like, why did I do that? Or how could I do that? Or, you know, shocked or just in disbelief that something like that is happening.
Yes, it's still, till this day, sometimes, not all the time, but it's still a haunting thought and image and memory of that day, yes.
So, you know, again, looking back on this, you had quite a journey to get to a point that you could understand what was going on and get the help that you needed. What would you say to other moms who are listening or who have had a similar experience to this or who may be suffering right now?
I would say 2 things. One is trust your gut, because I think I knew a lot sooner than I acknowledged that there was something going on. But because I started comparing myself to others, well, these moms are also struggling, and then I'll eventually become better just like they have. But so I didn't seek help right away. So just trust your gut. If you think that there's something going on, you know, ask for help. So I also want to add that the healing may look different for everybody, and there's not just one way for that to happen. In my case, I think for a long time I was resistant to medication, partly because there's such a stigma surrounding it. And I was resistant to going to counseling, and I thought, oh, I have an amazing support group, I'm just going to use that. But ultimately, it was the combination of a support group, counseling, medication. And later on, once I was better and feeling up to it, exercise as well. But, you know, at one point, I wasn't in a good place to even go out and exercise. Wow,
it's such a journey you've been on, and I know that you described being in survival mode, and that's what I hear is someone who's survived, and now you're in a position to kind of be back to yourself a bit and be living closer to the life that you want to be living. It takes an incredible amount of strength to get better.
Well, I've definitely had a great, you know, support system with my husband, and it was survival mode, and it took a long time, but yes, I'm finally at a good place where I can feel better. Yeah. And I guess I do want to add, one of my biggest fears during my struggle was that because I was not with my son for those first 4 days, I thought that he would never love me.
Oh,
and it was
that's
just
heartbreaking.
Yeah, so I knew I would tell my husband, he's going to resent me for not being there those first few days. And I just want to say, I remember the first time that unprompted, he said the words, "I love you." Mm-hmm. I just knew, okay.
Okay. Yeah, everything's okay. We are connected.
Yes.
Oh, wow. Well, I'm really glad that you got to a point where you could hear him say that, and that you got through all of this and you're able to be connected to him now and to your husband and living your life. So I just thank you so much for sharing your story. I think it's so powerful to do that, and such a gift, I believe, to be giving to other people to hear. And of course, there's so many other details in people's stories that we never hear and never get to, but there are so many women who have been through similar experiences to you. And there's so much power and healing in just hearing this reflected out in the world. And I hope that if there's a mom who's listening now and has been through anything similar to this, that you now know that you're not alone. And I thank you, Ingrid, for providing that and for sharing that with us.
No, thank you for having me. And yes, to that mom, I just want to tell them that, they are a good mom. Don't ever doubt that. And you are the perfect mom for your child.
That's awesome. Thank you, Ingrid.
Thank you.
I just want to take a minute again to thank Ingrid for coming in and sharing her story. It can be very hard to do. And for any of you who are listening who've ever tried to tell your story, it is hard. One of the beauties of telling our stories, moms who have had a perinatal mood or anxiety disorder, is that there's such power in helping other moms, and it can also be very healing for us to say it and kind of get it out of our mind and body and know that we're still okay. Everything's okay. And it's really powerful to hear Ingrid's experience specifically, because she had a very rough entry into motherhood, and it took her a little while, but she was able to get the help that she needed and figure out more or less what was going on and begin to feel like herself and feel better. And that's really what I hope that all of you hear as well, is that if you're suffering now, that there's hope for you. And for those of you who are therapists or helping mothers and families, that this message of hope, that with the right help that they can feel better, is really so imperative. So for those of you who want to talk more about this episode, please go and join our Mom and Mind Connection Facebook group. We'd love to have you there. It is building, and we're welcoming people into the community every day. So if you have things that you want to talk about specifically related to this episode or any of our previous episodes, that is the place to go for that. And I'd love to hear from you. So thanks so much for listening. Until next time. Thank you for joining us today. If you or someone you know is having a hard time, help is available. Please look for resources for help at momandmind.com. Also, please subscribe and share this podcast. Together, we can support moms and families so that no one has to deal with this alone. Thank you for being a part of the Mom and Mind community.